Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Limbach, producer of the Pharma Voice Webcast Network, and I'll be your moderator today. Welcome to our event, Boost Your Competitive Advantage with Claims Data, brought to you by Pharma Voice in partnership with our good friends at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. We have an outstanding crowd today with executives from across the industry. Thank you for investing the time to attend. We will certainly do our very best to make it worth your while. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of our webinar technology. Your GoToWebinar control panel will give you access to several functions. If you can hear me but are experiencing problems logging in to see the slides, you may want to try logging in using a different browser. We recommend the latest versions of Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Chrome. Tablets and smartphones also work if you have the free GoToMeeting mobile app. For any other issues, use the robust help options from your control panel or visit gotowebinar.com. And you can also send us a message using the questions function in the control panel, and we'll do our best to help you out. We're taking questions from the audience today, and you can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Just type your question into the questions text area in your control panel and click the send button. We'll also have a few audience polls during the presentation, so get ready to participate. You're going to be seeing and hearing a great deal of useful information, and you don't have to memorize everything during this live event or take copious notes. We are recording this event and we'll send you a link to the on-demand archive in a day or two so you can review the event at your leisure. Now that we're through with the housekeeping details, let's dive into the program. We have a very knowledgeable pair of experts with us today to help us understand the competitive opportunities associated with claims data and analytics. It's an emerging trend in the market intelligence space within our industry, but there are many issues to examine before you can dive in and benefit from this practice. We're very happy to welcome Richard Grape, Director of Market Planning and Innovation at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Richard is joined by Rebecca Hauk, Market Planning Manager at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Based on the turnout today, this topic is clearly an area of interest and it promises to be an informative session. I know I'm looking forward to it. Rick is going to start things off, and we'll hear from Rebecca as well throughout the presentation and Q&A. Rick, take it away.
Thank you, Dan. For those of you that are joining us today, we promise to cover a variety of different topics that should be impactful and meaningful to your organizations and business. To give you a little bit of background information on myself, so as Dan mentioned, I'm the Director of Market Planning and Innovation at LexisNexis. And that probably sounds like a little bit of a goofy title to a certain extent. So we actually have kind of a unique role here. We get to serve as part futurists, part visionaries. We work with the different sales, marketing, and product teams to set the overall market product vision and sales strategies. So I've had an opportunity to spend a little over a decade working in the healthcare and government markets. I'm personally a very passionate advocate for sharing data and the benefits of sharing data. I've actually led a number of different contributory initiatives and helped define their data sharing frameworks. So as we talk today and we talk about different data assets and best practices, know that I'm going to have a flavor and flair for wanting to talk about some of the benefits of using the multitude of different data assets that are out there and available in the industry. I'm joined today by Rebecca Hauk, who's a member of my team. Rebecca, would you like to give an introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rick. As Rick mentioned, I am the manager of market planning, so I work with Rick on some similar objectives. I've been with Lexis for about a year on our healthcare team with our claims analytics solutions, but I've been in the healthcare field for around a decade as well. My background is in Medicaid claims data sets and behavioral health care performance measurement and monitoring, some data collection and analysis. And I also have a background in like value-based payment principles and managed care readiness. And as a market planner, I really work with Rick and our team on setting our roadmap and our vision and work with our team members to identify kind of our potential enhancements and new products and evaluating our market opportunities. So we're really excited to be here today, so thank you for having us. So I'll hand it back to Rick.
Thank you, Rebecca. So as you can imagine, in the roles that we fill for our organization, part of our bag of tricks, so to speak, and purview is to do detailed market research and analysis on how different clients might use different data sets, how it can benefit their businesses and things like that. So again, for our conversation today, we're going to talk about how you can use this type of data to really boost your competitive edge, focusing on claims data that can be used to grow market share and really ultimately outsmart some of your competition. To begin our session today, we're going to discuss three main areas relevant to the life science, pharma, and med device markets. First, First, we'll spend some time discussing the state of the industry as a whole. So we'll talk about major trends that are impacting each of your businesses and ultimately that are having broader implications within the healthcare ecosystem. Second, we'd like to spend some time discussing claims adjudication, specifically which data sources are available within the market that can help inform your product development, your sales and marketing efforts, and ultimately the price points you choose to go to market with. And then third, we'll take some time to discuss the types of insights that ultimately can be derived from different claims types. We'll talk about submitted and remitted claims and other insights that can be provided to different groups within your organization, ultimately walking through some examples that should be relevant to different parts of your business. Finally, we'll conclude with some open forum Q&A. So please, as Dan mentioned, don't hesitate to use the question feature within the GoToWebinar to send questions over throughout the course of the presentation. We'll be sure to address these during the Q&A block. So to kick us off, let's start with discussing some of the different state of the industry. As we all know, healthcare is a constantly evolving and shifting market, influenced by policy and regulations. It's a landscape of big, but in many cases, very sensitive data. And in recent years, it's been under constant pressure to reduce costs and show greater quality outcomes. Over the next few slides, we'll discuss these and some other industry trends that are really working to shape the landscape, from the products you develop to the providers and payers who ultimately use these to treat their patient populations. So to kick off our industry discussion, I'd like to draw your attention to an ever-present thorn in many of our sides, and that's the ebb and flow of changing data that's critical to your sales and marketing representatives as they conduct targeted outreach for your products and business. Data changes all the time, so looking across the industry, you'll see practitioner data changes frequently. We'll see addresses, phone numbers, faxes, etc. Just during the normal course of business change with great frequency, week over week. Within a month, we'll see that about 2.5% of all practitioner demographics have some sort of change, and within 1 year's time, 20% of doctors can be seen to move or change their practice locations. After 18 months, we will ultimately see a full 50% of practitioner data change. As a result, knowing who to call, where they're located, how to get a hold of them, ultimately can make outreach and sales efforts quite challenging unless you have access to the most up-to-date and recent relevant information. As such, we encourage you as you're discussing with some of the different folks that you might partner with, talk about frequency of data, the multitude of sources that might be aggregated, and when those things are going to be not only updated, but how they're linked, how they're resolved down to an effective entity resolution. Those are areas that we've seen as a growing pain point across the industry as a whole. And an area that we want you to be conscious of because the data you purchase today will be significantly different 6 months to a year down the road than what you would expect. This is especially true as we turn our attention towards specialties and procedural knowledge, which changes quickly as providers add to their knowledge toolkits. The result really is a constant moving target of who saw who, when, where, what steps were performed, who they were redirected or referred to, and ultimately which products were used. It's often this information that's needed in order to effectively inform and influence early on any provider preference through your sales efforts. So as we talk about data and we talk about industry trends, we're going to talk about another one that continues to gain traction throughout the healthcare ecosystem, and which has become really a constant driver as organizations seek to tackle and really address the triple aim. That's reducing the cost of healthcare delivery, improving patient incomes, and ultimately enabling a better, more satisfying patient experience. And this is the start of an industry trend that is hallmarked really by the shift towards what we call alternate payment models, or APMs. These are indicative of value-based care approaches. Level setting, as we all know, 10 years ago, healthcare insurance was paid on volumes. Over the past decade, we've seen a significant shift from the number of services that were provided to the quality of those interactions, with market attention really driving towards an increase in accountability. Volume-based reimbursements are still commonplace, though they're beginning to trend towards this more value-based model. So I'd like to take a few moments and talk through a little bit of this shift from volume to value. In the market today, we see really 4 major categories of different payment models. Category 1 are what we call traditional fee-for-service payments. They have no link to quality. They're not adjusted to account for infrastructure investments or provider reporting on quality data or any kind of provider performance or cost quality metrics. Category 2 are what we call fee-for-service payments that are really linked to quality. So these are adjusted based on infrastructure investments that improve the care or clinical services that are provided. And that's whether the provider reports on quality data or how well providers perform on cost and quality metrics. Category 3 is where we start to see the shift towards these alternate payment models, and these are built on the fee-for-service architecture. So providing mechanisms for effective management of a set of procedures, an episode of care, or all health services. This shift is really where they can start to track costs and performance, holding providers financially accountable, and ultimately even inform them on appropriate care measures. The last category, category 4, these are more population-based payments. So these are driving providers to deliver more and more person-centered care. Some of you might hear of this as kind of like Cadillac care services. These payments hold providers accountable not only for quality and person-centered care goals, but they include things like preventative health, health maintenance, health improvement, as well as acute and chronic care services. So as we look at these, the things you'll see shift around is that of these different categories, you'll see APMs account for about 35% of all the payments within the industry. But the interesting part is that 35% really represents about 77% of the covered population, roughly 226 million Americans nationwide. This shift to me represents another topic we'll talk about in a little bit, and that is that move to consumerism, or really a shift towards a more patient-centric approach. While fee-for-service continues to represent a high percentage of payments, the fee-for-service decline is already steadily underway. We saw 2% in the past year alone, and we're seeing a lot of industry goals that are coming out from different groups trying to drive us towards a 50% shift within the next 5 years. As we see vying for value, things to take into account is that as you're interacting with any of the providers that you might be trying to bring your product or service in front of, or any payers that you might be working on their formularies, this shift is something that is top of mind for each of those audiences. So they're focused on pay for performance. They're focused on looking at where it's going to be patient-centered care management, where there's quality scoring or metrics that they can account for. They're going to be looking really at reimbursements and see if there's a performance-based option. And you see this a lot with ACOs, accountable care organizations, as well as this more global capitalization that we see across the industry. The next trend I want to talk about is really the shift that we've seen within the industry of cost to patients. Over the past few years, we've experienced a firm shift towards what we call patient responsibility. Patients are charged ever greater with ownership of the high financial burden for their healthcare. This is hallmarked with the shift from PPO to high deductible plans. Employers are seen to be lowering costs while industry monthly patient insurance costs are on the rise. The result is patients are paying more out of pocket. This is changing their buying decisions long term. So if you look to the right, you'll see that this is from a recent Bloomberg survey. It's accounting and looking at the percent of Americans who had moved from high deductible plans. And you'll see here that it's grown pretty significantly and consistently since 2010. Ultimately reflecting now roughly 18.2% that are on high deductible plans with health savings accounts. Why this is important to consider is that as you're engaging with providers and payers, they are not only shifting costs to their patient population, but they're also going to be really a mechanism for feedback on where a service might be deferred, a product might not be chosen due to that cost environment, and ultimately the patient's willingness to engage and have that care long term. So just something to be mindful of as a general trend within the industry. The next piece we're going to talk about is really the increased need for price transparency. So this accompanies that increase in patient financial responsibilities we just talked about. Last year, we saw the execution of a new presidential order that required hospitals to publish prices that reflect what people are paying for services. This action was taken really as a step beyond that, which was defined through the ACA, for hospitals to publish their standard prices on the internet. which was designed to increase price transparency and thus help consumers make better decisions. While the spirit of these efforts really was to make this information much more patient accessible, their execution honestly has been quite poor. So hospitals address this by making their charge masters available online. As you can see on the screen, this is an example from Barnes-Jewish. This does not necessarily make those hospital price points very easy to access. These charge masters are not easily searchable. They can be hundreds of pages long. At this point, we're at page 456. And that ultimately makes costs very difficult to decipher for even the most skilled consumer. We also saw towards the end of 2019, Presidential Trump proposed a new price transparency coverage rule. And this will require health plans to do a couple different things, and we want you to be aware of them because these are ultimately going to be top of mind if this were to go into enactment and be made reality within the next year. And this is first disclosure on public websites, so any negotiated contract rates for in-network providers as well as allowed amounts for out-of-network providers. A goal is to give consumers real-time, personalized access to cost-sharing information. So that's not only including estimates of their cost-sharing liability for all healthcare items and services, but to do so through a tool that shows different health plans, different insurers, and can ultimately go all the way down to specific line items on a claim or at the drug level tied to those consumers' prices. The final rule will require hospitals to really make this available in two different ways, and if it goes into effect, it would start in 2021. And that's both through what we call comprehensive machine readable files, as well as a display of shoppable services and more of an interactive portal type model. So these are another industry trend we wanted to bring to your attention. And then finally, the last sentiment we want to highlight is really the need to effectively gain consumer mindshare and keep all of their interactions and associations positive. So we're currently in the age of consumerism, and what that means for each of us might differ a little, but what that means to me is that we've got a diverse ecosystem of different entities that are able to provide services. We see about 8.5 million practitioners nationwide. And consumers can really pick and choose where they want to go, who they'll receive their services from, and in many ways, these things are being informed by the reviews from their fellow peers. So healthcare services, in my mind, are becoming more and more like a shopping mall. We've got consumers who are effectively picking and choosing who they want to manage their care. Part of this is effective patient engagement, but part of this for you all is making sure that you're on the formularies for those providers, for those institutions, facilities that ultimately have very positive patient engagement reviews, because that's going to ensure that your product receives preference compared to others within the market. Effective patient engagement is critical not only to initially gain, though, but also to keep their attention. I'll give you a personal example of this. So my wife and I recently had a baby. It's our first, so obviously there's a lot of changes ahead of me. She's just started getting teeth, which has made for some restless nights. But life events like this really determine where in the future my family will go to receive health care. If your insurance or your doctor doesn't require you to go to one specific hospital, that hospital will likely miss out on a number of different future client-related life events. In my case, our daughter entered the world with a little bit of difficulties, but the hospital we were at met those challenges, earned our loyalty, and as a result, if we had another, we'd be back. It also means that as she gets sick, if she's in need of any type of services, they've already got my initial buy-in as a potential patient, having had a very positive experience there. All of this really starts with patient engagement. So engagement enrolls not only the patient, but ultimately can also enroll their families to become invested in one another's health outcomes. The patient experience results not only in high levels of clinical outcomes, but on the patient side, a level of follow-through with the different prescriptive behaviors, recommendations of the providers that they see. This, in turn, when the patient's been effectively engaged, impacts their reviews, and 32% of which will directly impact all other future consumer decisions. And it's worth noting that each patient that sees these individuals has potentially a 1.4 million value to those provider organizations. So positive patient experiences ultimately will increase their choice of that provider for health services, and by being on their formularies or having already had a foot in the door with those practitioners will help increase your product preference as a mode of treatment as those situations arise. So to me, this brings us full circle. In terms of current industry trends, this shows that knowledge is key. Knowing the who, the where, the cost, and ultimately the options can help your business as you plan for product development, releases, sales force engagement, targeting, and ultimately outreach. But how can you effectively gain this knowledge given the immense number of providers that are out there, facilities that you might want to target? The reality is you really need data. You need good data. Data that will help you understand the value of your product within the industry. It'll help you look at what this means to patients, providers, payers, and ultimately any of the entities and how much they're reimbursing for it. So at this point, Dan, would you like to take over? I think we've got a polling question coming up.
Absolutely. So this is the first of 3 polling questions, and I'm going to launch the template here. We'd like to know, we all understand the healthcare industry is constantly changing. So we'd like to know which of these trends impacts you the most. Is it demonstrating product value amidst VBC arrangements? Is it treatment avoidance due to shifting patient cost? Or price transparency focus and individual product costs? Or is it consumerism shopping for healthcare? So we are going to just let you guys chime in and just click one of the circles to the left of each of those 4 possible answers. We'll just give you another moment here. They're coming in at a pretty good clip. Still coming in, so I'll give you another moment. Okay, I'm going to say last call, and let's close the results here, or close the poll and share the results. So they're really across the board, Rick. The VBC arrangements was the top vote getter, but they all got some focus here. What do you think of these results?
It's actually not that surprising. A little bit of surprise on the price transparency piece. So demonstrating value-based arrangements or value of your product amidst value-based arrangements, that does definitely seem to be a hot topic within the industry. To a certain extent, we're seeing that one actually impact the treatment avoidance. And we're seeing among a lot of patient populations, if the prices are too high, if there's not a clear link back to quality outcomes, that patients may defer doing those types of services and ultimately using a product or going through that preventative treatment with a practitioner. So not too surprising there. The consumerism piece definitely is something to be mindful of as you're interacting with any of the provider facilities that you're targeting or conducting outreach to. So good to see, Ben.
Excellent. Let me hide this, and you can continue the presentation.
All right. Rebecca, I think you're picking up at this point.
Yes, great. Thank you. So what are those specific challenges that you're all facing really in the life sciences, med device, DME space? And we're really looking at how can you find your niche in the market, right? You need to identify that market opportunity for your product, where your competition is focused, what's your market share, know which facilities and physicians are going to benefit from your product, how much can you charge, so what's that formulary impact? Knowing your niche is really important, right? So knowing where your product fits in amongst all the other products out there, how are you going to be able to differentiate your products? And doing this can be really challenging. What data do you have to do that? And we also need to know how to target sales and marketing teams. So we know this is a really big piece of what you all do. So what size sales force do you need? What are their territories? It's really important to understand what the HCP to HCO relationship is, and that being rolled up to the integrated delivery networks or the IDNs, the ACOs or the accountable care organizations, and the GPOs, the group purchasing organizations, to know where to target. We'll talk about this in a bit later, but targeting a physician may not always work if the hospital or the IDN or GPO has a contract with your competitor. So you'd really want to know that type of information. Needing to be able to focus your sales efforts and resources to get the biggest bang for your buck, right? You don't want to be wasting your time. Those opportunity costs are very expensive if you focus your efforts in the wrong area. And lastly, we're seeing that you need to really be able to identify the industry thought leaders and subject matter experts. These are the folks that are going to help promote your product, push your product. If you get a thought leader or expert to be loyal to your product, this can have a really huge impact on your bottom line. And identifying these leaders allows you to influence their decision making prior to treatment decisions being made. And so ultimately, this is really just saying that you're facing a lot of big challenges. You're being asked to do a lot more with a lot less, which is a pretty consistent theme I think that we're seeing, especially really in a value-based payment world, and that's the big issue that you were all just voting on. So we really need to spend time and money wisely, and we need to have access to accurate and recent data to be able to do that. So Rick, you can go to the next slide, please. So we're here to talk specifically around medical claims data as a way to find answers to address those questions. So where does your product fit in, and who to target your sales and marketing teams, how to identify thought leaders who can promote your product, all those challenges we just talked about. In the context of that changing healthcare landscape, it is more and more imperative to have access to the right data. So let's talk about what that data is. You can go to the next slide, please. So what should you be looking for from a data vendor if that's the route you go down? What types of data is needed to answer those big questions and challenges? First, we want to look at information about healthcare providers. There are millions of practitioners across the United States. Rick was just mentioning that. We have over 1,000 payers, and those millions of practitioners might be tied to a healthcare organization or an IDN, a GPO, an ACO. You really can imagine there's a lot of hierarchies and complexities here. You really need to know that basic information about those providers, like their MPI, their name, where they practice, their workload at each site that they practice. You need or want that sort of full picture on those practitioners. You also need accurate, timely, and complete coverage. So there are billions of annual medical claims out there, right? So every time you go to a practitioner, a lab, urgent care, I go to an office visit, it's at minimum, it's one claim is generated for that visit. So we might have multiple diagnoses and procedures. So sorting through all of that data there's a lot of data out there. So you really want access to a nationwide picture of unique patients in all settings of care. So you want as much of accurate and timely data as you can get. We're also looking at data sources. So you want to make sure you're having access to a variety of data sources, including government agencies like CMS with Medicare and Medicaid data, state data, clearinghouses, and switches. One data source does not have all of the information you would need. So you really want to be looking for a variety of data sources or a vendor that has access to multiple data sources. And lastly, when you're looking at data handling, so you want to have vendors that can identify and leverage the most recent submitted claim changes. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between submitted and remitted claims really briefly in a moment. But you want to be able to have access to the most recent data and accurate data on those submitted claims to help you make the right decisions that you need to make moving forward. You want to be able to combine those data sets to give you a really robust view of what's happening with procedures, diagnoses, patients, practitioners. And you want to consider vendors that have access to those changes and can accurately pull in the data points to give you that most updated information. And Rick, I know that you had a point that you wanted to make here, so I'll just pause for a second to let you jump in, but it was around, I think, the deduplication of patients.
Yeah, and that really goes back to what you just mentioned, Rebecca, on being able to effectively combine different data sets. And we hinted on this a little bit earlier when we talked about the dynamic landscape of really provider demographic data and how quickly that changes. So one thing to keep in mind as you are engaging with any data vendors in the industry, that deduplication of not only claims themselves as they might come from different sources, so the effective identification and resolving of that one claim where it might exist between multiple sources is key. But it's also important to note that we see and are starting to see within the industry some erroneous claims tied to really what that profile of nationwide picture, so to speak, of unique patients looks like. Just kind of level setting to folks in the room, if you hear claims that we have 400 million unique patients, have some speculation, ask them what their resolution process is like, where deduplication occurs, because as many of us will know, there's only about 331 million folks in the United States, and roughly 20 million of those are undocumented. There's a lot of children and foreign nationals that come in and influence that claim volume. So numbers as high as that are honestly unrealistic and show a certain amount of data discrepancy that's not being accounted for. So in order to safeguard yourselves and make sure you really are accessing the most relevant and accurate information, have that dialogue with any vendors that you might discuss. Ask them questions about how they resolve claims more effectively and what gates they have in place to ensure the quality of the results that they provide to you.
Thank you, Rick. So what is that claims adjudication cycle? So let's just talk a little bit about the submitted and remitted claims briefly, and why do we care? Why does it matter to us, and why we keep talking about it? So let's just say that you have a patient. I'm going to say it's me. I'll use it myself as an example. I go to see a specialist for a medical visit that occurs. That starts the claims adjudication cycle. That starts our cycle off. The coding specialist at my provider at my doctor's office, they're going to enter that medical visit information, and then it goes through this process of verification and claim submission. The claim is submitted, that's the 837 form, and once that is submitted, it's going to go through a denial and change process. Rick, if you can just hit the next piece, thank you. If there is an error or a missing data field on the submitted claim, this may be resubmitted. It could be resubmitted a few different times, which is why we talk about the importance of having the most accurate and recent resubmitted 837 form. And then the insurance basically validates the claim, and then they issue the payment. The payment generates a claim remittance form, the 835, which is what you or I would see after we go to visit our doctor. We receive summary visit information from the insurance company that lists out what was charged, what the allowed amount was, what I owe for my patient responsibility. So what's really important here is that we have both the submitted and remitted claims have valuable information on them. And so we're going to walk through that in a moment. But the point on that last one was just to say that that denial and review process is a valuable piece when you're looking for data vendors to make sure that they're able to capture really updated data sets. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So a quick overview. This is a really simplification of what a raw claim would look like. There's a wealth of information on a submitted claim, but the types of information that is really helpful for you when you're doing some decision making and you're aggregating data across lots of claims is when we're looking at diagnosis, so the ICD-10 codes, to understand really the nature of an illness. There can be more than one on a claim, so there could be someone with diabetes and high blood pressure. So you could have multiple diagnoses on a claim. Procedures are the CPT codes for services provided to that patient. So let's say there's a basic assessment done, they're checking A1C, they might check blood pressure, do an eye screening. So there could be multiple CPT or procedures that are done. We also look at drug information is a valuable piece here. So the HCPCS codes for medication that was administered. If someone's blood sugar spikes really high, they might need to administer insulin, for example, or maybe they give you a flu shot when you go to the doctor. So there could be multiple here as well. Then there's basic patient information, so age, gender, location, who the payer is. Is it a commercial or government payer? Is it information on the practitioner, so who provided that treatment, and then the facility, so some information on the facility. If you can go to the next slide, please. So on the remitted slide, again, this is a simplification, but there's a little bit of overlap, but it's not really one-to-one on what you're getting. So the major difference is really there's no diagnosis information on the remitted claims that you can see, because it's really less about why you're seeing, but more about what that doctor did with their time and what procedures they did, so they have to get paid for what they did, not so much why they did it. So again, the procedure information is here, so checking blood pressure, for example, or doing an assessment of some sort. Procedure detail, we could have some modifier codes and units on procedure detail here. So let's say there's modifiers, give you a little bit of extra information about what was done. So let's say you did a hip replacement, was it the left hip or the right hip, for example. Allowed amount tells you what can be charged for that code, so for that procedure, or for a medication that was administered, so what was allowed to be charged, who that payer is, again. A new field we'll see is the payee, so who's receiving that payment specifically, and then the place of service, so was it outpatient, office, inpatient, surgical center, et cetera. You can go to the next slide. So we have, I'm going to pass this back to Dan for our second polling question.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, this is the second of 3, and I'm going to launch this and introduce it. We'd like to know which industry data is most valuable for your organization's decision making. Is it consumer or patient third-party data? Is it provider third-party data, medical claims data, prescription claims data, or some other data source? And once again, I'll give you a couple moments to give us your response. They're still coming in at a pretty good clip, so we'll give you another moment. Okay, I'm going to say last call. We'll close the poll and let's look at the results. All right, so we do have a couple at the top, medical claims data and prescription claims data, but they all got some votes. So what do you think about this, Rebecca?
I think that this is pretty aligned with what we are seeing in the industry, and Rick, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is pretty consistent with what we hear from who we work with.
All right, great.
Yeah, we see a lot of value comes out of medical claims data. Prescription claims do also provide value, especially in the drug space, but there is opportunity to even capture some of that through different medical claims due to injectables and things like that. Consumer and patient data, as more and more patient engagement becomes an area of focus, we continue to see that as a growing area and trend for access, whether it's through things like social determinants of health or other mechanisms for potential outreach. Consumer data changes quite frequently, as I'm sure you can imagine as individuals. You know, you buy a new house, you move locations, you update your phone number. It's a constant moving target in terms of where and how to get a hold of you, things like that. And then similar to the provider data discussion we saw before with that changing demographic, I'm actually surprised that one's not a little bit higher, given that most outreach to those entities can be challenging if that demographic data has changed, and we see a pretty significant change within typically a 12-month window.
Okay, let's close these results and carry on with the presentation.
All right, thank you, Dan. So next we're going to talk about how you can work to gain a comprehensive or complete market view using claims analytics. As Rebecca hinted, there's a couple different areas tied to this that we'll talk about, insights that you can get from the submitted and remitted claims, as well as the links between them. I actually like to bring this down to what I affectionately call kind of the 3 legs of the stool for gaining that comprehensive view of market analytics. And that's volumes, networks, and reimbursements. We're going to take a little bit of time and talk through each of those. Returning to some of the challenges that Rebecca mentioned just a few slides ago, though, there's a multitude of different ways that we can address these through data. So organizations have the ability to leverage accurate and comprehensive data in order to make informed decisions, and their ability to do that effectively really ultimately will impact the overall preference and traction that their product has within the market. Whether it's performing simple market and competitive assessments to assessing sales and marketing targets, data really is key. Data that provides insight not only on the market and individual products, but the patients, the providers, the payers, and all of their respective behaviors. So on the screen, we're going to talk through kind of how some of your industry peers have leveraged claims data in order to evaluate volumes of procedures, the networks they may have been referred to, and ultimately the costs that were paid at a provider, payer, or patient level. One peer in the medical device space found that claims provided them a much better understanding of their target market, specifically the key players within it, and gave them an edge over their competition. Another used claims level intelligence to navigate the highly competitive market to gain and get their products to the doctors and patients who needed them effectively and efficiently. Others use claim-based insights to gain transparency into referral patterns and physician alignment strategies. So looking at patient volumes and payer reimbursements and really helping them to drive the conversation of how they differ from their competition. And then the final quote you'll see up there comes from a customer, one entity that was focused on interested in focusing their sales and marketing efforts really on high-value physician targets. So in many cases, looking at not only those that had high volumes, but potentially those that were part of high-volume networks, high-value IDNs, GPOs, ACOs, and they were able to use this targeting through claims insights in order to enlighten them on the clinical features and ultimate benefits of their products over others. So we're going to talk through this little wheel on the right over the next couple of slides, and we have some examples for you as we do so. The first one we're going to spend a little bit of time on is what we call volumes. As organizations work to provide actionable and impactful intelligence to their marketing and sales teams, we find ourselves at the beginning of this three-step process, what I like to think of as the three-legged stool for claims intelligence. This first leg, volumes, allows organizations to have a firmer understanding of the who. So who they do business with, who participates at a practice, who is seen in the network, and ultimately it's the how that goes often unknown. How are these providers practicing compared to their peers? How entrenched is your competition? How entrenched is your product or your competitor's products? Using claims volumes, you can help your organization really gain an opportunity to look beyond just the data and see a full picture of what your market share is, what your competitor's market share is, what the market size of a potential drug that you're evaluating taken to market, physician, facility, and patient volume, so specifically how much opportunity there is tied to it. You can look at diagnosis and procedures performed. That'll give you an idea of how often it would be adopted. And we can even look at drugs by indication. This intelligence helps not only with market intelligence, but as we've mentioned, sales targeting, really segmentation, and ultimately, as you're trying to craft a specific message, what is going to be receptive to that target audience. This is also used by some organizations for market and really sales force sizing, as well as doing that long-term assessment of product adoption. Has it been adopted effectively? Have campaigns that we've released had traction and the increase in volumes that were expected, and preference, so which physicians are indeed using it, and how you can work to identify targets to try and gain their mind share and preference long term. Comparing physicians at a regional level, you would likely know how they rank to one another. You'd likely have some idea of if they've leveraged your product, but you may not know the full opportunity that that provider or facility could represent to your business. Volumes can change this. They can shine a clear, bright light on this how much time a practitioner spends at each medical center, how many surgical procedures they're performing, what percent of those procedures is at each location, since each of these are ultimately indicative of what product they'll actually use based on the formularies that they may be purchasing off of. Next, we'll discuss some examples of this. Rebecca?
Yes, thank you. So let's just walk that through like one or two examples here. So let's say you're a sales rep for a DME supplier, and your supplier sells CPAP machines. You want to increase referrals to your supplier, and you want to focus on the sleep specialists or the neurologists who are referring patients, and you want to influence those physicians to use your preferred supplier. By using those claims volumes, as Rick was just saying, you can identify where physicians in your geography are sending patients for CPAP orders to be filled, identify if those orders are going to your supplier or a competitor, and you can target those physicians to use that preferred supplier. So we'll see in this slide, you're seeing you have 3 different specialists as an example who are referring to suppliers. We see the number of patients, their workload percentage at their primary facility, how many other organizations they're affiliated with. The next slide, please. But you need to know which providers are referring to your supplier. So let's say your supplier is Universal Med Supply right in the middle. They're Dr. Violet, Dr. Orange, Dr. Red at the top. They have a combined total referral number of 156 patients. You want all of them for your supplier, right? So right now we see that only 23 patients in the sort of pool of patients we're looking at are receiving their CPAPs from Universal Med Supply via referrals from Dr. Orange. But Dr. Violet is a rank 10 provider, Dr. Red is a rank 9, which means they're really seeing a large percentage of patients that you want to influence treatment decisions for outside of just Dr. Orange. You want to increase these referrals, right? So you need to be able to identify the appropriate locations for your sales reps in the field to maximize access to potential customers. So Dr. Orange, again, has referred 23 patients, but of the 156 referrals we're looking at on the page, 85% of them are going to your competitor. So we really want to, and what we also see on here, excuse me, is that Dr. Violet is referring over 50% of her CPAP referrals to Medical Express, and Dr. Red is looking at 25 to 50%. So that's kind of how we're looking at this screen here. This gives you a lot of information to use to target your physicians, a lot of opportunity to get more bang for your buck. Similarly, if you were a sales rep for a pharma company, a different kind of example selling, say, a new cancer drug, you want to identify those top specialists by claim or patient volume who treat those patients with your disease state of interest. You want to influence those physicians to use your new drug. You want to know, again, where those physicians in your geography are treating patients with the disease state of your interest that you're looking at. Identify other facilities they might be affiliated with to influence that treatment pattern at multiple sites. And you want to target physicians to use your new cancer drug and influence the treatment practice prior to treatment decisions being made. So really, volume-based insights from claims data can be used to identify those appropriate locations for your sales reps in the field to maximize access to potential customers. Back to you, Rick.
Thank you, Rebecca. So next, I'd like to spend a moment and give you another take on using claims volumes for industry insights. And this is really the concept of using these to trigger a very targeted alert for your organization. With the right solution, you can monitor and analyze billions of different medical claims to provide real-time or near real-time notifications on newly diagnosed patients for very targeted outreach when every second counts. So we see these alerts type products sometimes pop up in the industry where it's leveraged for more of this time-sensitive focused sales and marketing outreach, sometime between diagnosis and treatment actually occurring, so that you're able to help steer a practitioner towards diagnosis appropriate treatments that your organization brings to market. This is akin to thinking of it as kind of right time, right place treatment that can help identify qualifying patients and treating physicians. And it can also be an opportunity for you to conduct education to really inform them of a new treatment option prior to them putting a firm care plan in place. The next slide is going to give us a little bit of an example of this. This is a pacemaker example. So newly diagnosed bradycardia patients, if your organization manufactures a pacemaker or a pacemaker alternative or some alternate product, maybe one that even supports patients that are undergoing pacemaker implant, it would be very helpful for you all to know where instances of this new diagnosis is occurring, who has seen them, and ultimately who's likely to treat them as their condition is monitored and addressed. Getting in front of these practitioners that are seeing new patients up front before a firm care treatment plan has been determined gives you an opportunity to potentially gain mind share and product preference with them as they go about treating these individuals. Next, we're going to move on to the second leg of the stool, so to speak. And this is really after a patient has visited one of our doctors, be it Dr. Violet or Dr. Red, as we discussed. The next question is that naturally arises, where did that patient go? This brings us to that second part of our three-part process work, and that's more of the networks component. So who's ultimately being referred and where? Only by leveraging a significant amount of claims data sources can your organization expand the knowledge of who went where and why, uncovering really unknown provider relationships, connections, and referrals that might provide an opportunity to impact product adoption by targeting other stakeholders across that patient's potential journey. So organizations can leverage networks-based products in a multitude of different ways. Hospital systems, for instance, use it for leakage mitigation, patient acquisition, discharge management, network recruitment, things like that. Med device companies can learn which practitioners are likely to see a patient for a diagnosis, and then that can ultimately help you inform them as to your company's product over those competitors in the industry. The full view of these entities, who they refer to, where they practice, provides you with direct targets for your sales and brand outreach. So it allows you to identify which facilities are likely to use it, which practitioners are likely to perform the procedures, who are part of these patient care teams that ultimately are all stakeholders and influencers potentially in that patient's treatment long term. Next, Rebecca's going to give us some examples of this. I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca.
So let's say at a high level, you used volume-based insights to identify Dr. Walker as a physician you might want to target to influence his decisions. He's at the top of our tree here. With network-based insights, so that sort of next layer that Rick's been talking about, you're looking to target other high-value relationships that Dr. Walker refers to. So this, practitioner-practitioner relationships. Consider a primary care physician that diagnoses a patient with diabetes but refers out to endocrinologists for further treatment. If you have a new diabetic drug or medical device, that volume-based insight might tell you Dr. Walker treats a lot of those patients, but the network-based insight tells you that he has strong relationships with these other specialists on the screen. So you can use this information to really better inform your sales approach. Go to the next example. So similarly, you may be interested to know, or you might be less interested to know the HCP to HCP relationship, but maybe you're more interested in knowing what facilities that physician is referring to. So instead of looking at, well, where is this provider to provider relationship, we're looking at provider to facility relationships, so we can assess those patterns. You can target a larger hospital network or health system to influence a broader purchasing decision. And go to the next slide. So let's walk through an example in a little bit more detail. Let's say you're a sales rep for a medical device company selling knee replacements. Let's say you're brand B, you're on the right of the screen. Your goal is to get more surgeons using your knee, not your competitors. So with the volumes insights, you identified those big surgeons doing knee replacements. Dr. Parks on our bottom left here is an orthopedic surgeon. He's ranked 9. He represents a lot of volumes. He's a big surgeon you'd want to target. Dr. Parks is using brand A exclusively, so your competitor. And you want to target surgeons to influence the use of that new knee. This can be really challenging, though. It's hard to flip a surgeon from one company's knee to another's knee, for example. So you can see the surgeon may not have a choice. So the reason it's a challenge, the surgeon may not have a choice, right? If they're at a hospital which might work exclusively with one product, they may only stock one product. So you can see which hospitals are purchasing your products. That's kind of what we talked about in the last slide, that like HCP to HCO relationship. Some hospitals, those determinations are made by the hospitals, or others are determined by the IDN. So we also have Dr. Fields, who's using your brand. He's a rank 7 surgeon. He represents a decent amount of volumes. Brand B would see a lot more. Your product would see a lot more utilization if more referrals ended up with Dr. Fields. So targeting Dr. Parks may not work for you, but understanding the facility in which he works at might help. But another way of looking at this is that you might want to target Dr. Bay at the top, who is more upstream. And if you can influence the referral patterns of Dr. Bay to Dr. Fields, you could increase those the utilization of brand B. So next slide. Just being mindful of our time here. And then alternatively, let's say that Dr. Parks is using brand A, performs surgeries at multiple facilities. This really creates an opportunity to influence by facility as opposed to by physician. And you might have, through network-based insights, you can try to talk to these facilities where Dr. Parks performs other surgeries outside of just one agency to see if you can influence what product they're using. So using your product instead of your competition. I'll turn it back over to you, Rick, to do our final third piece.
Thank you, Rebecca. So the final leg of our stool, so to speak, brings us full circle on what we know. We've already talked a bit about what they did, where they went. So the next piece, in my mind, is understanding what did they cost. This gives an opportunity for you all to understand the potential ROI tied to those patients and providers, give you some insight on how your competition is pricing, and ultimately what contracting models you may want to leverage as you make strategic decisions. Reimbursement level insights can provide strategic planners and a wealth of market intelligence as they consider either looking at expanding their product offering, who they're targeting, as well as potentially formulary decisions that could be used potentially to maximize remittance rates across payers and facilities. We see a number of different metrics come out of remitted information, and tied to this, we've already mentioned part of that at a CPT code level. But there's other components like the HCP, HCO, an actual claim level, which can be rolled up, a payer level potentially. And we find that folks are using different metrics like min, max, median, mean, mode within the industry in addition to those other claim or code level insights I mentioned. So reimbursement data ultimately can help you understand what the ultimate patient responsibility is, and ultimately when they've reached their out-of-pocket max, and that can help inform how much is going to need to be negotiated on those formularies between the provider and the payers that they might be a part of. So Rebecca's going to give a few examples of this. Rebecca, I'll turn it back to you.
Yep, so as Rick was just mentioning, the reimbursement data really gives you visibility and line of sight into what was actually paid for a procedure. So the example on the screen right now is looking at the cost of an MRI by payer. So we're seeing that variance by payer. We see that the average payment for United, Aetna, and Blue Cross Blue Shield are similar, but Humana has a lower average payment and is more aligned with Medicare pricing. That's one example. You can go to the next slide. Another way we can look at reimbursement data is by place of service. So to determine the cost or the payment variation by that place of service. So in this visual, we're looking at the office setting. It's seeing a higher reimbursement than the home setting for this particular code. Go to the next slide, please. So having access to those payment details by payer or by place of service, this particular slide looking at by payer can help you better understand that median payment, calculate return on investment. Again, we can see the variance between the high and low. We can use this to inform your formulary with this data, drive higher contract values. So for example, if you're a sales rep selling those, like I say, MRI machines, you want to determine what to charge for your machine for market entry, what's the return on investment for your buyer, how many MRIs will they have to conduct with their new purchase before they see a return on their investment. So this type of data can be used for that. And we have one more example on the next slide. So what we're talking about here, let's say, is an oxygen machine used to treat folks with COPD. So as the med device manufacturer, you might want to use reimbursement insights to identify what others are charging and getting paid for their oxygen concentrator, to better understand the competitor landscape, what to charge suppliers. With that reimbursement data, you can use the median payment, for example, to help calculate the ROI for a supplier, see how they can determine their capital expenditure and margin on each device, how can they increase those costs and margins. And then let's say you're the DME supplier, on the other hand, who's supplying the oxygen machines to patients, and patients might have to pay a monthly rental fee for that oxygen. This can help the supplier. This type of data, reimbursement data, can help the supplier see what other suppliers are being reimbursed for it. They want to understand, again, same thing, competitive landscape here. And then at the payee level, you can, see you as one of the DME suppliers. You can see your own versus others in the DME space specifically. So reimbursement insights really combined with those volumes and networks allows you to have more of a comprehensive view of who's treating the patients, where you can target, and then what's being paid for those services. And these are just a few examples. So reimbursement insights can really be used to also determine some patient responsibility, identify denial rates, those variance and modifiers, place of service. So it's really important to consider vendors that can really help you meet this particular need, especially since we were talking so much about the value-based payment world, and that being one of the biggest areas of interest and changes that are affecting all of you on the phone. I think that reimbursement data really is such a key player in the space. So I'll turn this back over to Rick. Or actually, I think Dan for our last polling question, excuse me.
Yeah. Yep. So let's tackle the last one, and then we'll be getting into Q&A pretty soon. So what we would like to know is, if you were thinking about leveraging claims data, which would have the greatest impact to your organization? Is it volume-based claims insights, network-focused claims insights, reimbursement-based claims insights, all three of them, or is it just not applicable to your organization? And we will give you a moment to give us your responses. I kind of think I know where this one is going. All right, we'll just give everyone another moment here. And let's say last call. And now I'm going to close it and share the results. And as expected, all of the above was the leader, although it looks like if people had to choose one, they would pick reimbursement-based claims insights. What do you think about this, Rebecca?
I think this is really on on par with what the first polling question when we were asking around what are the trends that are really impacting the folks on the phone. So I think that this really aligns with that, and really what we are hearing as well in the industry around all of these being really valuable, but that reimbursement has sort of an extra layer that's really needed in this kind of new space with value-based arrangements. Rick, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I'm glad to see all of the above ended up topping the polls. For those of you that are focused on reimbursements, just know the successful resolution of submitted and remitted claims being linked together to ultimately inform your data feeds. That's an area we've seen that some folks have struggled with within the industry. So that kind of coupled with volumes allows you to really get a full picture. So make sure you have that kind of dialogue with any data vendors that you might be considering in the space.
Okay, let's close this and get through the rest of the presentation, and we'll hit the Q&A.
All right. Well, this actually brings us kind of to our wrap up for the day. So coming full circle, ultimately, we've talked about 3 different legs of what we're calling our claims analytics stool, so to speak, volumes, networks, and reimbursements. Each of these gives your organization a different level of understanding. So an understanding of what was done, where they went, and ultimately how much they ended up costing. So access to comprehensive claims intelligence can certainly be valuable to help increase market share. Accessing volumes and leveraging those can give you intelligence about the practitioners and facilities that are providing and influencing care, and potentially insight into the competitive markets. So going back to kind of an earlier statement, each of these gives you a little bit more information. They're expanding your knowledge of the who, the where, the costs, the options, so that ultimately you know the value of your product, and you're able to more effectively respond and meet the needs as the market shifts and changes, and as you have new and emerging potential targets for outreach and targeted acquisition. Rebecca, is there anything you wanted to add at this point before we click over to Q&A?
No, I think we've covered it. Hopefully we have time to do a couple questions here.
Yeah, so we're going to go into Q&A, and I know we are a little over the top of the hour, but we'll keep rolling through it, and just know that we're recording this. If you do have an appointment and you have to leave, you can always go back and look at the recording and see what you missed. But for the rest of you, I hope you stay and listen to some of your peers and what questions they're asking, and we'll get the response from our experts. So Rick, you're looking at the questions submitted. Why don't you start tackling them, and you can decide to take it yourself, hand it off to Rebecca, or you guys can both take on that question.
Okay. So one of the questions was, what is VBC? For those on the phone, VBC, I know we use it as an acronym, value-based care, and that's the transition of this move from volumes to value in terms of ultimate outcome for the patients. Rebecca, I know you've been entrenched in the value-based care world before. Is there any insight you want to provide on value-based care arrangements as you've seen them?
I think it's just for this particular question, just knowing that these arrangements are changing as far as the relationship with payers and providers or health systems, and also how payers are looking at their contracts with the life science companies and the organizations as far as wanting to know what is the value that your product brings and what's that cost. So they want to get, it's really how are we improving care for the ultimate patient while also keeping costs low. And so that's really kind of the concept around that value-based care and payment arrangements. And so I know Rick was going through kind of what some of those payment models are, but the ultimate shift is really just saying that we want to be able to quantify what the value is and compare that kind of to the cost. And so you want to be able to arm yourself for those conversations and those arrangements by having access to that data when you walk into those conversations.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Another question that we've got from folks in the audience are, what is the best source of medical claims payment information within the industry? So we actually see, as Rebecca mentioned, there's a variety of different sources. Many folks will leverage insights and data that come directly from CMS. That data is becoming more and more available within the industry, but it tends to often give and reflect just a narrow scope tied to that population. Clearinghouse sources are another great opportunity to capture different settings of care, understanding of payers nationwide. That helps if you're bringing in a multitude of different sources. That helps defer some geographic bias that might come if you're only looking at a specific data set or a specific type of program or patient population that might be coming in. Let's see. Another question that came up is, what type of different visualization tools do we see within the industry, and how are they used? So in order to talk about that, I think it's important to note that every organization kind of handles the interpretation of data a little bit differently. So we see some folks within the space, they have their own BI analytics platforms, at which point you would need that data to be provided typically as part of a flat file so that it can be ingested and used in-house. With many of the pharma, life science, med device clients, though, we also see, given that you have a broad sales population, oftentimes you need access to more of a web-hosted BI tool that takes that claims intelligence and allows it to be sliced and diced and self-served up in different ways through dashboards to more effectively get to targeted groups. And because your reps are often in the field, it needs the ability for them to access them from remote locations. We see some in-house kind of SaaS-grown stuff. We've seen some folks using Tableau. Power BI is one that's very popular within the industry right now, thanks to Microsoft. And we've seen a lot of very powerful visualizations come out of that tool. Rebecca, in terms of visualization tools, I know you've had an opportunity to interact with some of the ones that we've seen in the industry. Any comments you want to provide?
I think that you've covered most of it as far as like what's being seen out there. I think that important piece is to know that the underlying data is what's really the most important piece, because you can visualize any kind of data set in a really pretty way, right? Like any kind of dashboard can look really fancy and pretty, but you want to make sure you have really solid underlying data that goes into it. So you do want to put a lot of thought into what goes into those platforms. I think that we see that the larger companies are going to have their own analytics departments, like you mentioned, Rick, but some of the smaller or more medium-sized companies might be looking for a user interface to be given to them. And so kind of knowing what you need from a visualization standpoint is helpful. I think that we see that some folks want to be able to do sort of their own drag and drop and influence it themselves. Others want, you to present a dashboard right for them. So I think we see sort of a variety of those needs, but an important piece is really to make sure you have a solid data set underneath that is validated and has gone through all the checks from the data perspective, so that when you are making decisions on those visualizations, whether it's a UI that you built internally or you've purchased, you want to make sure that that is giving you accurate insight.
Yes, that's a great call out, Rebecca. It's ultimately only as good as whatever data lies underneath. So just because it's a pretty picture doesn't necessarily mean that it's bringing to the best intelligence to bear from the market. Another question that came in, I think is sort of related to this, it was actually specifically to us on the LexisNexis side, asking what database do we use for our medical claims, and within what percentage of the U.S. market do we represent in terms of covered lives. So Lexis actually employs a best-of-breed approach. So we bring in claims from CMS, a number of different clearinghouse and switch-type sources. We have a very robust de-identification process to make sure that duplication isn't captured and reported on erroneously. We also, as a business, have industry-leading provider data assets, so we can use that to inform those claims in terms of accurate location and address, things like that. So we have a repository, again, it's about 1.6 billion, and we actually have another large data source that's coming on later on this year that will continue to expand that, and it represents roughly 165 million patients across the United States, so a fairly good representation of the market. Let's see, I'm looking through the questions. I know we're kind of a little bit out of time. I think the last one that seems to have come from a few folks is that, will you be handing out a copy of this presentation and sending out the recording? Dan, why don't I pass this last one over to you, since I know you steward this.
Sure. So we are recording this, and we will have it available online, and it will contain all of the audio and images, because it is a video. So that's the best way to consume this after the fact. And I think if you wanted to get a copy of the slides, you could possibly send an email to either of our presenters and see if they're allowed to do that. But I do think having the audio in context with the images is definitely the best way to consume this. So hopefully you can wait a day or two, and you'll get an email with a link to that recording, and you can take care of that. So do we want to call it on Q&A then, Rick?
Yeah, Dan, if I can leave one final note for folks on the phone. Obviously, each of you work with a very specific segment of the market in terms of the drugs or products or devices that you're building and bringing to market. If for each of you, if there's an area specifically that you'd like to engage with LexisNexis on, we'd be happy to work with you and do an assessment in terms of your scope. So feel free to send us a note, and we're happy to put you in contact with the appropriate subject matter expert on our side.
Absolutely. So I hope you all enjoyed this event and you've taken away some new insights. We definitely covered a lot of information in this hour plus, and we've probably just scratched the surface. So make sure that you contact our experts if you want to follow up with anything. If any of your colleagues missed the presentation, again, it's going to be available as an archive, and it'll be a day or two, and you'll get that link to the video. I'd like to once again thank our friends at LexisNexis Risk Solutions for partnering with us on this great event. And I'd also encourage you to look for future web seminars by visiting pharmavoice.com. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. The event is now over.